And now we talk about the release of former President Jacob Zuma, and we get some legal analysis on this with legal analyst Elton Hart. Elton, I appreciate your time this evening. Let's talk about what's led to Jacob Zuma's swift release from prison just 2 hours after being ordered to return.
No, indeed. It is for the normal South African out there. It's like it seems like he just made a detour or a pit stop at the Escort Correctional Facility. And people won't understand, but there was a process that was foregoing as to remission of, and I think it was close to 9,500 prisoners that got sort of half a reduction on their sentence that came into consideration. And obviously the former president was also considered. And I know a lot of people will say, but how convenient. Yes, they look at non-violent offenders and they are considered, and that's something that sits in the Constitution. The president has that power to grant remission where they feel like the prison is overcrowded, to handle certain administrative and logistic things within the prison, and they would consider these types of prisoners that they would call category A or category B prisoners to be released because they're not prone to violence or known for violence. And fortunately or unfortunately for some people, the former president was one of those candidates, and he was released.
So let's talk about why Zuma was initially sent back to prison, and how did the Supreme Court decision influence this action?
No, indeed, the Supreme Court of Appeal felt like the decision by former Correctional Services boss Arthur Fraser was unlawful, and it was confirmed because the Constitutional Court said it goes on to the rights of a person, so they must give sort of the constitutional approval that there was some violation or there was something unlawful of a specific person's actions that infringed or sort of worked into another person's rights. And they confirmed that his actions as Arthur Fraser was unlawful and he must then be committed back to prison. Then the decision was, and he presented himself this morning at 6 a.m. But then last week, Thursday, there was an announcement already made that certain prisoners will receive remission from the president's desk, and he was one of the people that if you get a remission of 6 months, you take 6 months of his 15 months that he was sentenced plus the 2, then he's entitled again to be on parole in any event because he served more than half of his sentence. So then he was released. So the Constitutional Court and the Supreme Court of Appeal said it was unlawful what Arthur Fraser did, but there's nothing unlawful because the Director of Correctional Services, the Commissioner, he has that powers to now execute what the President says on the remissions.
Well, what legal authority empowered President Ramaphosa to grant remission of sentences?
It's the Constitution. The ultimate law of this country is the Constitution.
So now
it's one of the powers that sits in the Constitution for the President to use at any given stage when the need arises.
Now we have the opposition parties up in arms around this decision, threatening legal action. Is there any legal action that they can institute and come away victorious with?
Not in a million years. They will have to change the Constitution. They don't have the 2/3 majority, and unfortunately for them, they will shout and scream, kick in one corner, but the Constitution grants the President that power to actually grant prisoners remission. And unfortunately for them, former President Zuma, who was in that group that got remission, he qualified for it. If they go to court and say that he doesn't qualify, they must go and prove, because he was sentenced to 15 months imprisonment. It was not for a violent crime, it was for contempt of court. He served 2 months. Plus another 6 months makes him 8 months. It's more than half of his sentence. He becomes eligible for parole. Straightforward, simple.
So, Elton, let's look at the factors that would have influenced some call it a coincidence, in the remission that was granted by President Cyril Ramaphosa at this juncture where former President Jacob Zuma was scheduled to go back to prison. What are the factors that would have contributed to this decision?
No, simply the acting commissioner, he gets from the prison head at Escort will most probably make an application to him to say, listen, yeah, I've got a problem of overcrowding, and I think the total currently in our prisons nationally sits at 43% overcrowding. So he will make an application to say I'm overcrowded, and it sits in the Correctional Services Act, and the opposition party shouldn't act as if it doesn't sit there. He can make that application to say overcrowding, and I'm going to release some of the prisoners based on what the powers is. That is also vested with a head of a prison or prison a head of a prison is vested with. So he can even just have gone that route, but also asking the president to say, listen, yeah, I have this problem. What do we do? And then the president say, okay, let's reduce some of the sentences for the non-violent people. And he unfortunately fell, or fortunately fell, into that category. And what can we do? It's what the law says, is what's in the legislation. If they feel like the legislation is unconstitutional, then they must challenge that part.
Well, let's look at the other side of the coin. And the other side of the coin suggests that when when former President Jacob Zuma was imprisoned last time out, there were riots across much of the country that cost the country billions worth of dollars in repairs. Now, the prospect of Jacob Zuma going into prison again, for many, suggested that things could get just as tumultuous as they did around that time in 2021. Is this a coincidence, or was there some thought process that went into what are the implications of not offering Jacob Zuma remission and sending him back to prison?
No, indeed, if you look from the outside, you'll say most probably people were fearing that the July 21 unrest, we could see a repeat of that, and hence they granted him that. But if you go look at the legislation and see, does he qualify as a person that was sentenced to 15 months? Did they follow the processes? And if you find that the process was not followed, then you can go to court and appeal the decision. People might speculate, and I cannot, from where I sit, I cannot say that this weighed heavy on the mind of the president when granting the remission, but somebody out there that might be lurking in the back of their head to say that they are afraid that the July 21 unrest might reoccur, and hence he was also now sort of given remission so that they can't recommit him back to prison. And obviously the Correctional Services Act also gives the powers to the head of prison to actually also say, okay, a person will be sent home because of overcrowding. But I cannot dispel the notion, I cannot support the notion to say that that was something that weighed heavy. But I mean, a person that is not trained in legislation, legally trained, might hold that view because of the unrest that happened on the first time when he was committed to prison.
Now, you mentioned that the prisons are overcrowded to the tune of 43,500, or somewhere around
that. 43%. 43%.
43%.
Yeah.
So that's obviously a significant number. Now, the remission of 9,500 individuals, how much of a dent does that put on the 43%?
They look at certain prisons, and obviously prisons have different capacities, so they make some sort of a dent in the non-violent offenders that's among prison, but our prison population is still big. It might be, in general, if you look at 9,000 from our entire prison population, might be maybe 10% of our prison population that maybe got released. If I just roughly estimate, it might be a little bit lower, it might be a little bit higher, but roughly around about there by 8 to 10% of our prison population. So, and if one also convert that into money, because every day it costs at least the Department of Correctional Services, I think it's like roughly 200 rand per person to keep them in prison. So if you say 10,000 times 200 per day, you add up the figures over 6 months, then you start seeing, okay, this becomes significant numbers, and that also plays into the decision to actually grant some of the prisoners remission.
Legal analyst Elton Hart, appreciate your time this evening on News at Prime.